Well, I hesitate to tell my colleagues what they should do. I don't think they would thank me for doing that. But in fact, every teacher has his or her own way of doing that. I can only tell you stories, possibilities. My mentor was a professor at the University of Chicago named Everett Hughes. Everett Hughes, I sometimes think of myself as an anthropologist. And you know that anthropologists, one of the things they do is to find the lineage of descent, the line of descent. Hughes was a student of Robert E. Park, who was one of the great founders of American sociology. Park was a student of Zimmel, George Zimmel. So I trace my descent from Zimmel to Park to Hughes to me. Other people had different, even though we were in the same department. My old colleague Irving Goffman had a different line of descent because his mentor was an anthropologist named Lloyd Warner. Warner was a student of Radcliffe Brown. And Radcliffe Brown, the British anthropologist, was a disciple, in a way, of Durkheim. So it was a different descent. But what I learned from Hughes was a way of working. He didn't ever teach me how to do these things, but he said things that were very influential. When I began my research for my dissertation, I did a research about school teachers in the schools of Chicago. And I interviewed the teachers, and then I would write my notes, detailed verbatim accounts of what the teacher had said to me, who I was talking to. And I would give him the interview. And after I gave him, and he would write notes that were very interesting and very useful. He would ask questions. You should have asked about this. This is something to ask in the next interview, etc. He used the first interviews to help me improve what I was doing. But one day I gave him the interview and he looked up at me and he could be very abrupt. He said, "Why are you giving me this?" I said, "I thought I was supposed to." He said, "You know how to do this. Don't bother me with this." So when you're all done and you start writing, then we can talk. So I learned something from that I could do it myself. The teacher didn't have to hold my hand and take me down the road. That was a very important lesson. He taught me another very important lesson. When I was when I was writing the Thèse about school teachers, he looked up from his desk one day and said, "It's about time that you wrote an article." I hadn't thought of myself as someone who could write an article. He said, "No, you have to write an article." I said, "What shall I write about?" He said, "Well, you wrote your master's thesis about musicians. Write something about that." Okay. But, it was 100 pages. What shall I write? He said, this was a wonderfully useful idea for me. Take one idea in your master's thesis and any other idea that you can attach to it in a way that makes sense to a reader, put that in. If you can't find a way to do it, leave it out. He solved one of the major problems that we all have, like what should be in this and what do I leave out? He said, if it sticks, okay. If it doesn't, no. It's a very simple rule, but a very useful one. And over the years I worked with him, I learned other rules like that. I think the most important thing a mentor can do is show you how to do the everyday work, not how to have an idea. Everybody has ideas. We all have ideas. But how to take an idea seriously and work with it. That's what he showed me. That's probably the most important thing I learned from him. I feel sure, although I have no way of knowing, that he learned that from Robert Park. I don't know where Robert Park learned it. Probably not from Zimmel. I don't think the relations between students and professors in German universities, when Park wrote his PhD thesis, were quite of that kind. But he had worked in the newspaper business. He had been a reporter. He had been an editor of a newspaper. So I think he learned things that way, which then came into sociological practice through him. Okay, that's one kind of thing that a teacher can do, that a mentor can do. Another thing that they can do, and some don't, is to do two things simultaneously. Tell you when you're going wrong, when you're doing something that will probably not work, will probably not be useful, and also to tell you when you're doing something right. Right? Some teachers only like to tell you when you're doing something wrong. That's not useful. It just discourages you. It makes you unhappy. But also telling you only when you do something right is not useful, because we all do many things that are not going to work. And one of the things that is really important is to learn when to stop following an idea and to say, this idea is not working. I can't find the thing that I'm looking for. Maybe it's not there. It's very useful to learn that the idea you had was wrong. Because when you learn it's wrong, you learn that something else is right. Right? What's left is right. What's wrong, okay, get rid of that. Now, one of the problems about the social organization of higher education is that we almost always are told we must plan our research very carefully in advance. I never wrote a thesis in the hard sciences, in physics or chemistry or biology. So maybe it's important when you, I'm sure it is, when you plan an experiment to do all the thinking. Although it probably helps to try a few things first to see what might work and what probably won't work. But when you're doing work in social science, you can't work that way. You can't say, I'm going to take a sample of so many people who have these characteristics, and I'm going to ask them these questions, and I'm going to analyze the data in this way, which is what we're often asked to do when we write a research proposal. Now, the professors, the senior researchers, also have to do that because they write research proposals, which go to the Agence Nationale de Recherche and other such organizations, where they're judged by colleagues. If the colleagues are smart, they know that this is only talk, that the real research will not be like this, because it can't be. If I knew before I started exactly how to do the research, I would know the results of the research. I wouldn't have to do it. because the way you do the research rests on a knowledge of the thing you're studying. When I studied school teachers, I knew very little about the career of a school teacher. I didn't know. I mean, I had gone to school in the elementary and high schools in Chicago, so I knew what it was like to be a student, but I had no idea what the life of a teacher was, what the problems of a teacher were. And so I had to find all that out. And so every interview I did told me something that I hadn't known, that I built into the next interview. I could not have made a list of questions to ask before I started. I could only make the perfect list of questions when I was through, right? In a way, the result of my research was a list of questions to which I had some answers that were, you could say, provisional, that is, subject to change. Okay, so that's something else that a teacher can teach you. Now, I don't know if you meant this, but many people would mean this by asking a question like that. Can I expect them to help me find a position after I graduate? It's a very reasonable question. I learned a difficult lesson. Some professors at the University of Chicago, where I was a student, worked very hard to find jobs for their students. Hughes did not do that. He did nothing to help me find a job. At the time, I was resentful. I thought that was terrible. Now, many years later, I feel it was a very good thing, because it was just as happened when he told me, when he asked me, why are you giving me these interviews to read? You know how to do this. He was telling me, find out how to find a job. That's part of getting a job, is learning how to do it. And I can't tell you, he said none of this. But he said, I can't tell you because I don't know what it's like now to look for a job. The whole idea of a professor helping you to find a job rests on a situation that no longer exists. It was just dying, this possibility, when I finished my PhD, which was that there would be networks of influence and of patronage, you would have like a parent, right, who took care of you. And I remember hearing one of the senior professors at Chicago talking to the head of a sociology department somewhere in the country and saying to him, Forrest, it's nice to talk to you. This was one of his students who was now the head of a department. I have a very fine young sociologist to recommend to you. And then he mentioned one of my colleagues who got that job. Okay. Well, that doesn't exist. Now everything is competitive. There are rules, and it simply can't be done that way. I don't know. In France, I'm sure there are still influence being exerted, but I don't know exactly how it works. I'm glad I don't know. I don't want to know. There are other ways they can help you, things like helping you find an outlet for the things you write, a place to publish, and so on. But you know all that. The other things I think that I mentioned are more important.